In 1887, in the wild territory of Montana, Jake Morrison, a lonely and distrustful cowboy, comes across a starving native child wandering near his property. Against all his instincts and the prejudices of the time, he decides to help the boy. His compassionate decision triggers a series of events that will transform not only his view of native peoples, but also his destiny. The next day, Jake awakens surrounded by 200 warriors, discovering that his choice to save a life changed everything, but not always in the way we expect. Jake Morrison's weathered hands gripped the reins tighter as his horse picked its way through the rocky Montana terrain. The autumn of 1887 had been harsh, and winter was promising to be even crueler. His ranch, though modest, was his sanctuary in this unforgiving wilderness, where survival depended on keeping to yourself and trusting no one. The sun hung low, casting long shadows across the valley, when Jake first spotted the small figure hunched near the creek that bordered his property. His instinct was immediate and sharp: trouble. In these parts, unexpected visitors usually meant cattle thieves, claim jumpers, or worse. His hand moved instinctively to the Colt 45 at his hip, but as his horse drew closer, Jake's defensive posture shifted to confusion. The figure wasn't a man at all, but a child, couldn't be more than 8 or 9 years old. The boy's dark hair hung in matted strands around his gaunt face, and his clothes were little more than tattered rags that offered no protection against the biting wind. Jake had heard the stories, of course. Every settler in the territory knew about the tensions with the local tribes. The government's policies had pushed many native families off their ancestral lands, and desperate people did desperate things. But this wasn't a warrior or a threat. This was just a child, and he was clearly starving. The boy looked up as Jake approached, his dark eyes wide with a mixture of fear and defiance that cut straight through Jake's hardened exterior. There was no pleading in that gaze, no begging, just the quiet resignation of someone who had already accepted whatever fate was coming. Jake dismounted slowly, his boots crunching on the frost-covered grass. The child didn't run, though every muscle in his small frame seemed coiled for flight. Up close, Jake could see the sharp edges of the boy's cheekbones, the way his clothes hung loose on his skeletal frame. This wasn't just hunger, this was starvation. "Easy there, son," Jake said quietly, his voice rougher than he intended. He'd grown unused to speaking gently to anyone. "I ain't gonna hurt you." The boy's eyes darted between Jake's face and his gun, understanding the English words but remaining silent. Jake realized the child was calculating his chances, whether this white man would show mercy or become another source of pain. Jake had built his life on simple principles: work hard, mind your own business, and trust no one. The frontier had taught him that kindness was often repaid with betrayal, that helping strangers usually led to trouble. Every rational thought in his head screamed at him to turn around and ride back to his ranch. This wasn't his problem, but those eyes, hollow and ancient in such a young face, wouldn't let him leave. "You hungry, boy?" Jake asked, though the answer was written in every line of the child's body. The boy nodded once, a small, careful movement that seemed to cost him great effort. Jake sighed, feeling something inside his chest loosen, a knot of isolation and suspicion that had been tied tight for years. Against every instinct that had kept him alive in this hostile territory, he made a decision that would change everything. "Come on then," he said, gesturing toward his horse. "Let's get some food in you." The child hesitated, studying Jake's face for signs of deception. The frontier had taught them both to be wary, but hunger was a more immediate master than caution. Slowly, the boy rose on unsteady legs, accepting Jake's outstretched hand. As they rode back to the ranch, the child seated in front of him on the saddle, Jake felt an unfamiliar weight of responsibility. He told himself this was temporary. He'd feed the boy, maybe let him rest for a night, then send him on his way. But even as he formed these plans, some deeper part of him knew he was lying to himself. The ranch house was small and weathered, built from logs Jake had cut himself when he'd first claimed this land 5 years ago. It wasn't much, but it was sturdy and warm, and right now warmth was what the child needed most. Inside, Jake set about preparing a simple meal: beans, hardtack, and some preserved beef. Nothing fancy, but more food than the boy had probably seen in weeks. As he worked, he stole glances at his unexpected guest, who sat silently by the fire, absorbing its heat with the desperate gratitude of someone who had been cold for too long. "What's your name, son?" Jake asked as he set a plate before the child. The boy looked up at him, then spoke in a voice barely above a whisper: "Ayana." It wasn't an English name, and Jake didn't recognize the language, but it didn't matter. A name was a beginning, a bridge between two worlds that had been at war for longer than either of them had been alive. Ayana acted slowly, carefully, the way people do when they've learned that food is precious and uncertain. Jake watched him, feeling something shift in his understanding of the world beyond his property lines. This child wasn't the enemy he'd been taught to fear. He was just a human being in need of help. That night, as Ayana slept on a makeshift bed by the fire, Jake sat at his kitchen table staring out the window at the vast Montana landscape. He'd acted on impulse, on some buried instinct for compassion that years of frontier living hadn't quite managed to kill. Tomorrow he'd figure out what to do next. But tomorrow would bring consequences Jake couldn't imagine, and choices that would test everything he thought he knew about survival, loyalty, and what it truly meant to do the right thing. Jake woke to the sound of horses, not the familiar rhythm of his own mare in the paddock, but something else entirely. Multiple horses, moving with purpose and discipline that made his blood run cold. The first pale light of dawn was filtering through his cabin windows, and what he saw through the gaps in the wooden shutters made his heart hammer against his ribs. Warriors, dozens of them, maybe more than he could count from his limited vantage point. They sat motionless on their horses in a perfect circle around his property, their silhouettes dark against the morning sky. No war paint that he could see, no weapons drawn, but their presence was unmistakably intentional. Ayana stirred by the dying fire, and Jake realized with crushing clarity why these men had come. The child he'd rescued wasn't just any starving boy. He was someone important, someone whose disappearance had mobilized what looked like an entire war party. Jake's mind raced through his options, each one worse than the last. He could try to slip out the back, but his horse was in the barn and he'd never make it across the open ground. He could barricade himself inside, but that would only delay the inevitable. Or he could face them, though every story he'd heard about encounters between settlers and native warriors ended badly for the white man. "Ayana," he whispered, crouching beside the boy who was now fully awake and staring toward the window, with an expression Jake couldn't read. The child rose slowly, moving to peer through the shutters. When he saw the assembled warriors, something changed in his face. Not fear, but recognition, and something else that looked almost like relief. "They came for you," Jake said, though it wasn't really a question. Ayana nodded, then looked up at Jake with those same dark eyes that had convinced him to show mercy the day before. "My grandfather," the boy said in halting English. "Chief." The pieces fell into place with sickening clarity. Jake hadn't just rescued any child. He'd saved the grandson of a tribal chief. And now, faced with his grandson's disappearance, that chief had sent what appeared to be his entire fighting force to find answers. Jake's hands trembled as he reached for his rifle, then stopped. What was he going to do? Shoot his way through 200 warriors? The absurdity of it almost made him laugh if the situation wasn't so terrifying. A voice called out from beyond the cabin walls, speaking in a language Jake didn't understand, but in a tone that was unmistakably a command. Authoritative, patient, but carrying an underlying threat that needed no translation. Ayana looked at Jake, then moved toward the door. "I go," he said simply. "Wait." Jake caught the boy's arm, surprised by his own reluctance to let him leave. In less than 24 hours, this child had become something Jake hadn't expected. A responsibility, maybe even the beginning of something that felt dangerously like family. But more than that, Jake realized he was terrified of what would happen once Ayana stepped outside. Would the warriors see his kindness as kidnapping? Would they view his attempt to help as an act of aggression? The frontier was littered with the graves of men who'd misunderstood the intentions of those they'd tried to help. Another call from outside, closer this time. Through the window, Jake could see that several warriors had dismounted and were approaching the cabin. Their movements were controlled, disciplined, but purposeful in a way that made his mouth go dry. If you've ever found yourself caught between doing what's right and what's safe, tell me from which part of the world you're listening to this. Jake made a decision that went against every survival instinct he'd developed. He set his rifle aside, opened the door, and stepped out into the morning light with Ayana beside him. The sight that greeted him was more overwhelming than anything he could have imagined. Warriors stretched in every direction, their horses stamping and breathing clouds of vapor in the cold air. But it wasn't chaos. It was organization on a scale that spoke of military precision and unified purpose. At the center of the circle sat an older man on a paint horse, his bearing unmistakably that of someone accustomed to command. His hair was streaked with gray, and his weathered face carried the weight of years and difficult decisions. This had to be Ayana's grandfather, the chief who had sent 200 warriors to find one small boy. The chief's eyes moved from Jake to Ayana, and Jake saw something in that gaze that he hadn't expected. Not anger, but profound relief. The kind of relief that comes from finding something precious that you thought was lost forever. Ayana stepped forward, speaking rapidly in his native language. Jake couldn't understand the words, but he could hear the tone, explanatory, urgent, and strangely protective. The boy kept gesturing back toward Jake, his voice growing more insistent with each exchange. The chief listened without interruption, his dark eyes never leaving his grandson's face. When Ayana finished speaking, the older man turned his attention to Jake with an intensity that made him feel transparent, as if every thought and motivation was being weighed and measured. For long moments, the only sounds were the breathing of horses and the whisper of wind across the valley. Jake felt the weight of 200 gazes on him, felt the precarious balance between life and death, hanging on the decision of a man whose language he couldn't speak and whose culture he barely understood. Then the chief spoke, his voice carrying clearly across the morning air. The words were in his native tongue, but they were followed by something that made Jake's breath catch in his throat. Other warriors began dismounting, but not in preparation for attack. They moved with purpose, but their weapons remained sheathed. Several approached the barn, others spread out around the property, but their actions seemed more like organization than aggression. Jake realized with growing amazement that something unprecedented was happening. He'd expected violence, expected to pay for his kindness with his life. Instead, he found himself at the center of something he couldn't yet understand, but that felt momentous in ways that went far beyond his own survival. The chief dismounted and walked toward Jake, each step measured and deliberate. When he stopped, he was close enough that Jake could see the intelligence in his eyes, the calculation, and something else that looked almost like approval. Tomorrow would bring revelations that would challenge everything Jake thought he knew about honor, loyalty, and the true meaning of sanctuary. The chief extended his hand toward Jake in a gesture that bridged two worlds. His weathered palm bore the calluses of a lifetime spent riding and fighting, but his grip was firm without being threatening. When he spoke, his English was accented but clear, each word chosen with the precision of someone who understood the weight of language. "I am Chief Standing Bear," he said, his voice carrying the authority of generations. "You saved my grandson." Jake felt the tension in his shoulders ease slightly, though he remained acutely aware of the armed warriors surrounding his property. "I'm Jake Morrison. The boy was starving, sir. I couldn't leave him." Standing Bear studied Jake's face for a long moment, as if searching for deception or hidden motives. "Many of your people would have turned away. Some would have driven him off with violence. Why did you not?" The question hung in the morning air, and Jake realized he didn't have a simple answer. His whole life had been built on the principle of self-preservation, on the understanding that in this harsh territory, helping strangers was often a luxury that could get you killed. But looking down at Ayana, who now stood close to his grandfather's side, Jake understood that some choices transcend logic. He was just a child, Jake said finally, hungry and scared. "I reckon that matters more than other things." Standing Bear nodded slowly, then spoke rapidly in his native language to the warriors around them. Jake couldn't understand the words, but he could hear the tone shifting, becoming less tense, more purposeful. Several warriors began unsaddling their horses, and Jake realized with growing amazement that they weren't preparing to leave, they were preparing to stay. "My grandson tells me you shared your food, gave him shelter by your fire," Standing Bear continued. "He says you asked nothing in return, showed no fear when he could not speak your language well." Jake glanced at Ayana, who was watching the exchange with an intensity that suggested he understood far more English than he'd let on the night before. The boy met his eyes and offered a small smile that transformed his gaunt features, reminding Jake suddenly of how young he really was. "Where are his parents?" Jake asked, the question emerging before he could consider whether it was appropriate. Standing Bear's expression grew heavy with old grief. "Dead. The winter sickness took them last year, along with many others. Ayana has been difficult since then. He wanders away from our camp, searching for something he cannot name. Yesterday he traveled farther than ever before." The pieces began forming a picture that Jake was only beginning to understand. This wasn't just about a lost child. It was about a boy adrift in grief, seeking something his own people couldn't provide. And somehow Jake's simple act of kindness had become part of that search. "We tracked him through the night," Standing Bear explained. "When dawn came and we saw the smoke from your chimney, we feared the worst. White settlers and our people. The history is not good." Jake nodded. understanding the chief's concern. The newspapers were full of stories about conflicts between settlers and tribes, each side viewing the other through the lens of fear and mistrust. His decision to help Ayana could easily have been interpreted as aggression or worse, as some kind of trap. But Ayana spoke for you, Standing Bear continued. He told us of your kindness, your gentle hands when you tended to his hunger. He said you treated him not as an enemy, but as, the chief paused, searching for the right words, as a son. The weight of that statement settled over Jake like a heavy blanket. He thought he was simply providing temporary shelter, but to Ayana, it had meant something far more profound. In his grief and wandering, the boy had found something in Jake's rough care that resembled the family he'd lost. One of the warriors approached and spoke quietly to Standing Bear, who nodded and turned back to Jake. We have decided to make camp here for several days. My grandson needs time to understand what he found in your kindness, and perhaps there are things we can learn from each other. Jake's eyes widened as he looked around at the warriors, who were now efficiently setting up what appeared to be a temporary village on his property. Teepees were being erected with practiced speed, horses were being led to graze near his pasture, and cooking fires were being prepared. His isolated ranch was suddenly the center of a community unlike anything he'd ever experienced. Sir, I don't know if this is such a good idea, Jake said, his voice carefully respectful but worried. Other settlers, if they see this many warriors on my land? Standing Bear's expression grew serious. You are concerned about your safety among your own people. It wasn't a question, and Jake realized the chief understood the complexity of the situation better than he did. By showing kindness to Ayana, Jake had crossed an invisible line that might make him suspect among other white settlers. And now, with a full war party camped on his property, he might be seen as a collaborator or worse. Where are you watching this story from? I'd love to know which city you're joining me from. We will not bring danger to your home, Standing Bear said firmly, but we also cannot leave without ensuring that what began here yesterday continues to grow into something meaningful. My grandson has found something with you that our grief could not provide. Perhaps it is healing that comes from unexpected places. As if to underscore his grandfather's words, Ayana moved to stand beside Jake, taking his rough, calloused hand in his small one. The gesture was simple, but it carried the weight of trust that transcended the barriers of language and culture. Jake looked down at the boy, then up at the chief who had risked everything to find him, and finally at the warriors who had laid down their weapons to make camp on his land. He was standing at the center of something unprecedented, a moment when two worlds built on mutual suspicion and fear were choosing to trust instead. But even as hope began to bloom in his chest, Jake knew that their real challenges were yet to come. The outside world wouldn't understand what was happening here, and there would be consequences for all of them that none could yet imagine. 3 days had passed since Standing Bear's warriors had made camp on Jake's land, and those 72 hours had transformed everything Jake thought he knew about survival, community, and what it meant to belong somewhere. The mornings began with the sound of children laughing, something Jake hadn't heard on his property in the 5 years since he'd built his cabin. Ayana had been joined by several other young ones from the tribe, and they played games that needed no common language, their joy echoing across the valley in a way that made Jake's chest tighten with emotions he'd forgotten he could feel. The warriors, rather than the threat Jake had initially perceived, had become something he'd never expected: neighbors. They'd helped him repair a section of fence that had been damaged in a recent storm, working alongside him with an efficiency that spoke of shared understanding rather than mere obligation. Their skills with horses had improved his own small herd's health, and their knowledge of the land had revealed resources he'd never noticed despite years of working the same soil. But it was the evenings that had changed Jake most profoundly. Around the communal fire that now burned each night between his cabin and the temporary village, stories were shared in a mixture of languages that somehow everyone understood. Jake had learned that Standing Bear had once been a young warrior himself, facing many of the same challenges that Jake encountered as a settler. The chief had lost friends to violence, had struggled to find his place in a world that seemed determined to tear apart everything he held dear. "You remind me of myself at your age," Standing Bear had told him the previous evening, as they watched Ayana teaching Jake's horse to respond to whispered commands in his native language. Alone, suspicious of others, believing that strength meant needing no one, Jake had wanted to protest, to maintain that his isolation had been necessary for survival. But watching the easy cooperation between people he'd been taught to fear, he began to understand that his loneliness hadn't been strength at all. It had been fear dressed up as independence. On the fourth morning, everything changed again. Jake was helping one of the warriors, a man called Swift Arrow, repair a bridle when the sound of approaching horses reached them. But these weren't the disciplined sounds of Standing Bear's people. These were the chaotic rhythms of riders in a hurry, and they were coming from the direction of the nearest settlement. The transformation in the camp was immediate and heartbreaking. Warriors who had been laughing and working alongside Jake moments before became alert and dangerous, their hands moving instinctively to weapons. Children were quickly gathered and moved to the center of the camp, and the easy atmosphere of cooperation evaporated into something tense and ready for violence. Jake counted 7 riders approaching, and he recognized most of them. Fellow settlers from the territory, including Sam Fletcher, whose ranch bordered Jake's to the east. These were men he'd known for years, men he'd traded with and worked alongside during difficult seasons. But the expressions on their faces as they took in the scene before them were not those of friends coming to visit. They were the faces of men who believed they were riding into enemy territory. "Jake Morrison!" Fletcher called out as the group reined in their horses just beyond the circle of tipis. "What in the hell is going on here?" Jake stepped forward, very aware that he was now standing between 2 groups of armed men who viewed each other as mortal enemies. Behind him, he could hear Standing Bear speaking quietly in his native language, probably giving orders that Jake hoped involved restraint rather than preparation for battle. "Sam," Jake said, keeping his voice steady despite the hammering of his heart. "These people are my guests." Fletcher's face contorted with disbelief and something that looked like betrayal. "Guests? Jake, there's near 200 savages camped on your land. Words reach the fort. They think you've been taken hostage or worse." The word "savages" hit Jake like a physical blow, not because it was directed at him, but because he could see how it landed on the people behind him. Men who had worked beside him, shared their food with him, trusted him with their children, reduced to a slur that denied their humanity. "They're not savages, Sam," Jake said, his voice carrying more authority than he'd expected. "They're people, and one of them is just a boy who needed help. If you've lived through something that changed your perspective on people you thought you knew, leave me a comment telling me which country you're listening from." One of the other settlers, a man Jake recognized but didn't know well, spat into the dirt. "Looks like they've addled your brain, Morrison. No good Christian man would willingly harbor this many hostiles." Jake felt something fundamental shift inside him at those words. For years, he'd defined himself by the approval and acceptance of men like these, white settlers who shared his background and, he'd thought, his values. But looking at them now, seeing the hatred and fear in their faces as they stared at people who had shown him nothing but kindness and respect, Jake realized he'd been wrong about what kind of man he wanted to be. "Ayana!" he called out, and the boy stepped forward from where he'd been standing close to his grandfather. "This is the child I helped. He was starving, and I gave him food and shelter. Everything that's happened since then has been about family looking out for family." Fletcher's hand moved toward his gun, and Jake saw similar movements among his companions. But before anyone could draw a weapon, Standing Bear stepped up beside Jake, his presence commanding immediate attention. "I am Chief Standing Bear of the Lakota people," he said, his English clear and dignified despite the tension crackling through the air. "This man showed kindness to my grandson when he could have shown cruelty. We came to understand why, and we have learned much about honor from him." The silence stretched for long moments, broken only by the sound of horses shifting and breathing. Jake could feel the weight of decision pressing down on him, not just his own choice, but the choices that everyone present would have to make in the next few minutes. Then Fletcher spoke, his voice hard with finality. "You've got 1 hour, Morrison. Get these people off your land or we'll be back with the cavalry, and when we come back we won't be asking politely." As the settlers wheeled their horses and rode away, Jake realized that everything he'd thought he wanted, acceptance among his own people, a quiet life of isolation and self-sufficiency, had just been offered to him as an ultimatum. All he had to do was send away the people who had become, in 4 short days, closer to family than anyone he'd known in years. But looking at Ayana, who stood beside him with trust shining in his dark eyes, Jake knew his choice had already been made. Some bridges, once crossed, changed you too fundamentally to ever go back. The question now wasn't whether he would choose sides. It was whether he was brave enough to face the consequences of choosing love over fear, community over isolation, and hope over the safety of staying exactly as he'd always been. In 1 hour, Jake Morrison would discover what kind of man he truly was.